tiny, vibrating strands of energy, occupied an infinite universe. The particular ways these strands wiggled produced various particles. Among these first particles were quarks. The universe cooled, allowing quarks to bind into groups of 3, forming baryons. These baryons also bonded, forming nucleons. Again, the universe cooled, and tiny electrons were captured into the nucleon's orbit. And hydrogen first formed. Due to gravity, knots of hydrogen gas began to coalesce into large knots, eventually forming galaxies. In the outer arm of one of these galaxies, an enormous cloud of gas had formed. In pillars of this gas, new stars were being produced. In the core of one star, hydrogen fused to form helium, later, beryllium, and ultimately, carbon. Eventually, the star burned up all its fuel. Following a supernova, the star's elements were seeded throughout the galaxy. Shock waves propelled a particular knot of gas into its own region of space. In time, most of the gas gravitated towards its center and ignited as a new star. Most surrounding matter was vaporized. Some heavier debris, however, remained in orbit. This debris began to gather, forming clumps. Then larger conglomerates, and eventually, planets. One of these planets endured a hostile infancy. The planet's surface was bombarded by comets and ravaged by volcanic eruptions. Volcanic steam rose up from clouds. Then returned as liquid water. And oceans formed. Meanwhile, meteorites from the supernova penetrated the planet's atmosphere, delivering carbon, nitrogen, and hydrogen into hot pools of water. The sun's energy catalyzed chemical bonds between these molecules, forming new carbon compounds. Two such compounds, hydrogen cyanide and ammonia, bonded themselves, forming adenine. Adenine linked with other nucleotides, forming RNA. Some of these RNA molecules could self-replicate. Eventually, DNA replaced RNA as a more efficient replicator.
The products of one chemical reaction become the raw material for new reactions. At some level of complexity, a catalyst becomes an enzyme. An amino acid chain becomes a protein. A loop of chemical reactions become a metabolism. And chemistry becomes biology. On our planet, and perhaps countless others, life arose. The DNA molecule, which is the basis of all organic life on Earth, is more intricate by far than any spiral galaxy, because the structure of DNA contains something new, something that was missing from inanimate matter before the origin of life. It contains information. The DNA molecule encodes not only the information necessary to make copies of itself, but the information necessary to construct an entire organism.
Other molecules, lipids, formed tiny bubbles. Particles inside were kept safe from external forces. Soon, DNA found a new home inside these bubbles. In time, a new inner force began to influence the sustenance of these structures. The presence of microtubules may have allowed for quantum computations to take place in these structures, making them alive. They reproduced. They metabolized food. They sensed their environment. Some cells evolved chloroplasts, making them photosynthetic. This released oxygen into the atmosphere. More advanced cells began to form colonies. In time, they could no longer function independently. They behaved entirely for the whole. And the first multicellular organism was born. Nerves and muscle later evolved. These animals could now move. In flatworms, a new bilateral body plant first appeared. it evolved a head, 2 eyes, and a brain. In acorn worms, a heart and circulatory system evolved, and gill-like structures. In Pichia, a primitive nerve cord evolved. Canodonts evolved teeth to help with ingesting plankton. In primitive fish, like Hycorystes, the first true backbones appeared. Protective armored plates evolved around the head and thorax. A complex brain allowed, for the first time, a capacity for memory. Bones and fins first appeared. With powerful jaws, hunting soon replaced scavenging. Bones, in their fins, broadened into the first limbs. In a sea of predators, these limbs proved to be favorable. Limbs enable an escape onto a new, safe, territory. Lungs enabled them to breathe on land. Scales retained water, keeping these land animals cool, and reptiles were now equipped to colonize the uplands. With blood and oxygen being pumped through an advanced heart, they could now travel at higher speeds. Bodies further developed. Body temperature was first regulated with the evolution of sails. Cynodonts evolved a mammal-like jaws with specialized teeth. They bonded in pairs. Their new jaws created space for middle ear to develop, heightening their awareness. One branch of cynodonts, mammals, evolved body hair for insulation, and milk glands, to feed their young. Their brains evolved in neocortex, an area associated with higher functions. A common genetic ancestor of mice and humans speciated. One group of mammals took to the lower branches of trees, feeding on fruit and leaves. Their claws, however, limited their adeptness in the trees. In early prosimians, grasping hands replaced claws. Forward-facing eyes gave them improved vision. Bigger brains enabled them to process complex 3D worlds in the trees. They stood more erect. From these prosimians evolved a new social animal. Their snouts were more narrow. They could see in color. they were more intelligent. Egyptopithecus marked a divergence of Old World monkeys and apes. The common ancestor of the gibbon and human speciated. The common ancestor of orangutan and human speciated. The common ancestor of the gorilla and human speciated. The common ancestor of the chimpanzee and human speciated. It evolved larynx, a precursor to speech. For millions of years, these apes thrived in Africa's Great Rift Valley. But then drought hit, and new walking descended from the trees in search of food. Walking on two legs had many advantages. Improved scope of vision over tall grass. They could travel longer distances. Their hands were freed up to perform other tasks. The drought continued to get worse, and they were forced into a new diet. Meat. Homo habilis was the first animal to construct tools. A diet including bone marrow fueled further brain growth. A more erect posture caused the voice box to descend in the throat. Body hair began to shred, allowing sweat glands in the skin to evolve. This enabled them to remain in the sun for longer periods. As sweating replaced panting, the mouth was freed up, allowing for primitive voices to develop. At some point, Homo erectus resisted an instinctual fear of fire, and fire was first tamed. campfires brought, for the first time, a period of leisure, a time to contemplate themselves and their world. This forward thinking marked the arrival of a new people, Homo sapiens. They were no longer scavengers, but hunters. A major drought hit, and they migrated towards the sea. A diet of shellfish spurred further brain development. Language developed, as well as art and jewelry. But the sea became too salty, and one group decided to flee Africa across the Red Sea, up the Arabian Peninsula. A lighter complexion enabled their bodies to produce sufficient vitamin D.
For tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens lived throughout Africa. But only some of these people were our ancestors. By 60,000 years ago, our ancestors were on the move, and their expansions started to have staying power. We don't know how fast or how far they traveled. Today, hunter-gatherer groups move, on average, about 1 kilometer a year. It's about a half mile, but it's not always consistent. What we do know is this. As their descendants moved into new environments, they became more isolated from one another, setting the stage for the high level of genetic diversity that we see in Africa today. By 50,000 years ago, people started making more sophisticated tools and creating a lot more art. Did new language abilities spark this burst of innovation? Maybe a genetic change in the population allowed some people to express more complex concepts through language, and so to outcompete those who couldn't. No one really knows. Around 50,000 years ago, small groups of travelers crossed into Asia, possibly as few as 100 people in all. Everyone alive today who has any non-African ancestors is probably descended from these travelers. Within a few thousand years, climatic conditions became drier, and the Sahara Desert expanded, making it harder to turn back. The intrepid travelers and their descendants followed a coastal route eastward in Asia, reaching present-day Malaysia within a few millennia. Did they meet Homo erectus along the way? By 45,000 years ago, people were living in parts of Australia and making their mark. In order to get there, they had to cross the 90 kilometers, that's about 50 miles, of open water, which separates Australia from the nearest islands of present-day Indonesia. Just how this was done, no one knows. It's amazing to think that people reached Australia and Europe at around the same time. Traveling eastward and southward along the coast of Asia, people didn't experience big environmental changes. But heading northward into Europe, they faced extremely harsh, cold climates and tough terrain. As humans moved into Europe, they also ran into the Neanderthals, who had been living there for hundreds of thousands of years. The Neanderthals were stocky and physically better adapted to the cold climate. But the newcomers proved to be very skilled at shaping natural materials into useful and attractive objects. Though the Neanderthals may have acquired some of their neighbors' advanced technologies, they soon found it hard to keep up. Human success might have meant the Neanderthals' downfall. The two populations coexisted, even interbred, for a few millennia. But by 35,000 years ago, Neanderthals were confined to the southwest corner of Europe, and soon thereafter they had disappeared. Another unsolved mystery. Yes, our story is full of them. Homo sapiens outlasted their cousins and expanded their reach across Africa, Eurasia, and Australia. But soon, times got tough for everyone. How would our ancestors cope with the extreme temperatures of the Ice Age? "20,000 years ago, the world suffered in the depths of the last Ice Age. For several thousand years, global average temperatures stayed 15 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 8 degrees Celsius, below what they are today. And mile-thick glaciers covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. Outside the ice-covered regions, it was so dry that survival became difficult in most areas. Some areas where people had been living became inhospitable. And in some other places, new barriers of ice or desert separated groups of people. But against all odds, some people found ways to survive in severe conditions, as far north as Siberia. The Ice Age not only created barriers, it also created bridges. With so much water locked up in ice, sea levels dropped, exposing land and connecting Siberia and Alaska. A few people in Siberia took advantage of this bridge, moving into present-day Alaska and later down into other parts of North America. Maybe they followed migrating herds of big game. Or maybe they traveled in small boats down the Pacific coast. Or maybe they did both. No matter how they got there, those people who did became the ancestors of today's Native Americans. In just a short time, humans from a small corner of Africa had populated all continents save Antarctica. And in their new homes, their languages began to differentiate, to form the precursors of today's languages. Some populations probably didn't survive the Ice Age, and those that did often became more isolated from other groups. Scattered around the world, these small populations became more linguistically, culturally, and genetically distinct from one another. How would cultural innovations help a few of these groups to expand dramatically over the next several thousand years?